I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Camarillo City Council. If we could have a roll call, please.
Councilmember Kildee?
Here.
Councilmember Martinez-Bravo?
Here.
Councilmember Tennyson?
Here.
Vice Mayor Tremblay? And Mayor Santangelo.
Here. The purpose for us opening at 4 o'clock is to go into closed session. If I could have the city attorney read the closed session item.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. We have 2 items listed on the agenda for conference with legal counsel, and if there's any reportable action, I will make that report later this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll go into closed session.
Councilmember David Kennison, would you lead us tonight, please?
I would be happy to. Please place your hand over your heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, approval of the agenda. Approve the agenda as submitted. We'll get down to general public comments for the sanitary district. The mic is not on. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Okay. Okay, so we're going to get down to the approval agenda, and now we're going to down to general public comments. So is there any public comments for the Sand District tonight? So I don't see anybody come forward to. We'll get down to the consent calendar.
Move approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second, and if hearing no further discussion, please vote. That passes unanimously. Okay, board comments and staff comments. Any comments from any board members tonight or staff or anything? All right, that's going to get us down to item B, which is a joint discussion with the item what's going to be concurrently on the city council agenda. So until we hear that, we'll be in recess.
And I will reconvene the meeting of the Camarillo City Council. Let the record reflect that all council members are present. And do we have any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll continue on. And we'll start with our item B, which is our presentation. And it looks like David Schlungen and Helen Fall are going to make our presentation on the Camarillo Ranch Foundation Financial Review for 2022.
Good evening, Mayor Santangelo, council members, city staff, and citizens of Camarillo. My name is David Schlungen. I'm on the board of directors of the Camarillo Ranch Foundation, and Helen Fowl is here with me. She's also on the board of directors and is our acting secretary.
No, President, Secretary, Treasurer.
Excuse me, yeah, treasurer, yes.
That's what I think I'm
Yeah. Yeah, we're here as the mayor announced to present the financial statement for fiscal year 2022. And just for your and the citizens' information, our fiscal year starts on July 1st, 2021 and goes through June 30th of 2022. And that's what this review is for. But before we get started there, I did just want to thank a few individuals. First, I wanted to thank the city. We have a great partnership, and it's because of that partnership that the foundation is being able to thrive at this point and bring back events after COVID-19 shutdown that the citizens are enjoying. I'd like to specifically call out Carmen Nichols for her relationship that she's had with the Ranch Foundation, Kevin Jorgensberg, and also Ryan Mitchell for keeping the property as wonderful looking as it is. Also the landscaping, for keeping the landscaping beautiful. I'd also like to thank the other board of directors of the Camarillo Ranch Foundation. We're all volunteers, but we love this city and we love the ranch house. So we are honored to be able to keep the legacy of Adolfo Camarillo and the Camarillo family moving forward and going on. Also, I'd like to thank the citizens of Camarillo as well as local businesses for their contributions during this tough time that we had with COVID and their continued support of us throughout COVID-19 and the following years after. We couldn't be here standing in front of you without their support. So thank you very much to them for all their assistance with us. I had sent a package to all the council members prior to the meeting for you to review, and Helen and I would be happy to answer any questions that council members might have.
No questions?
Mr. Tremblay.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Helen, and thanks to you sincerely for all of your service, and thank you to all the board of directors and all the volunteers and the docents and everyone who makes this, makes the ranch house run. We really are sincerely indebted to you, and the community's indebted to you, so thank you. I just had a couple of quick questions, because I'm sorry, I just had a chance to look at the review statement for all of about 30 seconds. And I'm understanding that it goes through June 30 of 2022. So this is probably an unfair question for you, but where would you say, in terms of the current assets and the investments, the current assets as of the year ended June 30, 2022, were about right around $50,000 or $46,000 in cash, and investments were at about $99,000, almost $100,000. Has there been a material change in those in the 12 months succeeding June 30, 2022, in the last 12 months?
It goes up and down.
Mhm.
Investments, so depending upon the stock market.
Right.
It will go up, and it has gone up a little, but we're financially secure. We have plenty of funds to carry on through next year, the next year probably. We have never touched, all through COVID, everything, we never touched the investments.
Okay, so the,
Managed to survive without touching them.
so the two things. So the investments, right, those have stayed untouched. From a cash standpoint, are you is the foundation in relatively the same situation as of June 30, 2022?
Currently, yes, it's relatively the same. We did have last month our first Throwback Thursday event, which was very successful, and we did get some income from that. So that has bumped that figure up a little bit. But then again, we're going to be paying for upcoming events as well. So we've kept, as a board, trying to do everything that we can to keep that level pretty stable. So in case of any issues that do come up, we do have funds that we can call on to assist us.
Okay.
It's
Sorry.
interesting because our docent program, the docents earn about $300 each month, just on the $5 fee to enter and into the house. Then we do have some special tours that go on. We don't charge anything for the school tours. We
Right.
believe that the school tours are a service to the schools and to our mission statement states that we would be an educational facility. So that's an important part to have it for the schools.
And I would add, too, that you also did a great paper shredding event, for which I'm very grateful, having contributed papers to that as well. So thank you again for answering my questions, and thank you for your service, and to all the members of the board, all the docents and the volunteers. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Do we have any other questions? Do we have any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
Excuse me. I also wanted to just reiterate and thank you for all the work that you are doing. I know that there is some clinical research that indicates that when a person is highly connected to their community, that improves their mental health. And I think the work that you are doing is doing just that. I have been very fortunate to join my daughter at one of the docent programs through her school. And, you just see how these children's faces light up in their experiences there. And I'm so glad that we're back, after COVID, and that you're able to, keep the organization moving forward. But you are making such an impact, and some of it, you may not even know who these people are, but I am just so grateful for all of the work that you do. Thank you.
Do we have any other comments? Mr. Kildee?
Just kind of quickly, thanks for your service, both of you, longtime people that are a big reason why our city's so great. But it's nice to see getting back on track here, and that's a really good thing. And if you could pass that along to the board members, that we really appreciate their efforts on this.
Thank you. Yes, we'll definitely do that.
We appreciate your support, likewise, because it wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the city and its contributions. And we wouldn't exist at all if the city hadn't seen the value in buying a historical house and keeping it up. So it goes way back.
It does.
Thank you.
Yes.
And
Go
if
ahead.
I may use this opportunity for a shameless plug, we do have, again, our next Throwback Thursday
Yes.
event happening on Thursday, July 27th, 5 to 8 p.m. Again, it's a free event. We'll have about 12 or plus food trucks there, live band, and activities for the children as well. So again, 5 to 8 at the Camarillo Ranch House on Thursday, July 27th.
It's country music this time, isn't it?
Yes, Caught Red-Handed will be the band playing, so if you like country music, come again. And Tony and all of you, you have mentioned it, I forgot to mention it. Yes, the docents are an integral part of what we do and our success. And they're all volunteers too, and I can't thank them enough for all that they do. So I just wanted to make sure that I called out that as well for
And we're
them.
always looking for more.
Yes. So, yeah, anyone is interested, we do have applications on our website at www.camarilloranchfoundation.com. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak to all of you, and I hope to see you at our upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for being here and for your presentation. Okay, that brings us down to board and staff comment and report. I'm going to go first tonight because I think I'm going to be short. On July 29th, I attended the Healthy Camarillo Ad Hoc Committee with Vice Mayor Tremblay. On July 6th, I attended the CPA board meeting. On July 30th, I attended a special meeting for water bonds and rates. And on July 10th, I attended the Naval Surface Warfare Center 60th anniversary of their commemorative ceremony. That was really lovely to be there. And that's all I have for tonight. And so, Mr. Kildee, we'll go to you.
All right. So meetings attended, June 29th, a VRSD special meeting. Also on June 29th, I was at CSUCI with Mr. Tennyson was there too, and we had a meeting with Southern California Edison, and the CEO of Edison was there, so it was good to be introduced to him. Also that same day, bittersweet for me, I attended the closure of the Ventura County Correctional Facility. They've been in Camarillo address for decades, and it was bittersweet to see the closure of that. We have a long history, several adorations of what's happened out there. I did have the pleasure, however, on Saturday night to be at the concert at the park, and it was a really good concert. I was able to give an opening address along with the Pleasant Valley Recreation as well. So that was a lot of fun, and I did attend the fireworks on July 4th here, and I parked across the street, but 20-minute show, and I thought it went really well. People were all over. It's interesting where people go to these type of things, but very well receptive, and I think it's important for us to keep doing this. There's a lot of people that really appreciate the efforts of this, and I know it's been through a lot of changes through the years with that, but it's still a really good event with a lot of support, and I think people feel good about, celebrating July 4th in that way. So that's all I have tonight.
Mr. Tremblay.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Let's see, meetings attended June 29, Ad Hoc Committee with the Mayor, and on July 7, a Ventura County Transportation Commission meeting. Two items, one with respect to VCTC. Two things. One is that on June 29th, VCTC did announce the grant of just under $75 million by the California Transportation Commission for rail and active transportation and EV charging projects in Ventura County. These are, in essence, SB1 funds that are coming to the county through the Transportation Commission. But most significantly, there are, as you may already be aware, there are several projects which will be affected in Camarillo which will be helpful in Camarillo. One is to put in just over 3 miles of the double tracking, second main track between Camarillo and Oxnard on what's commonly known as the Leesdale area. The second, the pedestrian undercrossing at the train station, which will help make the train station compliant with ADA. And then 6 electric vehicle charging stations, 2 of which would be here in Camarillo. The second thing to note from a transportation standpoint is that the legislature, in one of its budget trailer bills, did continue its suspension of the farebox recovery, farebox revenue recovery amounts. Remember that is an amount that traditionally, if a municipality did not meet that in its transit operations, it was subject to fines or penalties by the state. That was suspended during the period of COVID, during the period of the pandemic, and because of the financial conditions of transit carriers, I'm looking at Mr. Klotzel as I say this, I'm looking at Mr. Cruz as I say this, there's been a lot of interest on the part of transit carriers to continuing to suspend that, and that in fact has been suspended through, I think it's through the 25-26 fiscal year. Finally, I think probably a lot of folks got these code compliance notices in the mail from folks just saying, hey, code compliance for the city is going to be conducting proactive code compliance inspections. And that actually did precipitate some questions to me about, well, what happens if I have, if I let my lawn go during the drought? I've got a dead lawn. Know the feeling, but anyway, I have a dead lawn. Is code compliance going to be aggressive with me relative to a dead lawn because of the drought? And the answer is no. What code compliance is really focusing on is landscaping, though, that is overgrown or weedy. So if there are 3 or 4 inches of weeds, or it's otherwise very overgrown, or if it's encroaching or blocking the sidewalk, then or it is going to harbor rodents or something like that, or constitutes a fire hazard, then code compliance will act in that case. My understanding is code compliance is very sensitive to the fact we've been through this long, sustained drought that we're hopefully coming out of, and it is very appreciative of efforts to conserve water. So there is, my understanding is there's not going to be any enforcement on dead grass unless it's truly a fire hazard. So I want to put people's minds to rest. Because I got asked questions about it. And that's it. Thanks, Madam Mayor.
Dr. Martinez-Bravo.
Thank you. June 29th, I also attended the closing ceremony for the Ventura County Youth Correctional Authority, or facility, and I just wanted to thank all of the people who have worked there for so many decades to help the most marginalized and the youth who are most in need. June 29th, I attended Throwback Thursdays at the Camarillo Ranch House, so it was a lot of fun. July 4th, I also went to the Camarillo Outlets, and it was, I went with my family, so it was like more than 20 kids. But we had a wonderful time. We parked at the outlets, and it was a very busy time, especially with, so many people showing up. But traffic control did a wonderful job, so I just wanted to thank the Ventura County Sheriffs for your work. And July 7th, I attended a meeting with 2 educators from Moore Park College, CSUCI, and Cal Lutheran. That's Dr. Estrada and Dr. Baca. July 10th, I attended the Port Hueneme Naval Surface Warfare Center 60th anniversary commemoration, and I joined our mayor, Susan Santangelo. July 11th, I met with 2 employees from Independent Living Resource Center serving Ventura County, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo. And they are a disability nonprofit, and they really offer services to assist in technology, benefit assistance, housing navigation, and peer support. And so, in just speaking with them, one of the individuals had a disability himself, and I think it's just important for us to continue to look at how we can continue to be more equitable to all people within the city and throughout. And Camarillo Old Town is holding its Heritage Days, the Midsummer Fair from July 12th through the 16th. from 4 to 8 p.m. That's over by Studio Channel Islands, which will also be open. They will be having the DJ, carnival rides, food trucks, games, and Friday through Sunday, they will be having live music. So my children are already there with my family. It's going to be a great weekend. So I wish our community a fun and safe time. Thank you.
Mr. Tennyson.
On July 6th, I attended the RDP 21 board meeting, and that afternoon, the Association of Water Agencies of Ventura County. And I just wanted to publicly welcome Captain Jason Hendren, I got the right first name, with the Camarillo Police Department. He's Commander Tennyson's second in command at the station and has previous history in Camarillo, and welcome, Jason.
Your Honor, I neglected, excuse me for this. With council's concurrence, I'd like to adjourn in the memory of Walt McKinney, and Walt McKinney was a longtime Camarillo resident here, and I'll have some comments to say at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that brings us down to our consent calendar.
I will move our consent calendar.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Without further discussion, please vote. And that passes unanimously. Okay, that will bring us down to our first public hearing of the night, which is item J, the zoning ordinance amendment for self-storage facilities. And David Moe?
Thank you, Mayor Santangelo. Our new assistant planner, Brett McMahon, will be making the presentation.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Council. My name is Brett McMahon, and tonight I'll be presenting on a proposed self-storage zoning ordinance amendment. Beginning with some background, back in the fall of 2021, the Camarillo City Council approved a moratorium prohibiting any new self-storage facilities in the LM and M1 zones through September of 2023. And then since the moratorium took effect, staff has found that self-storage facilities are currently permitted in 4 zones in the city. And throughout these 4 zones, we have a total of 12 existing facilities in the city. And then just some more research that staff found. Staff also found that 75% of these facilities are located within the LM and M1 zones. They are also clustered along the 101 freeway, and they have an average parcel size of 3.5 acres, and they only employ about 3.5 people per facility. Next, staff conducted a case study on 2 of the more recently approved self-storage facilities in Camarillo, which are Trojan Storage, which was approved in 2021, and occupies a 4.25 acre site by the freeway that will only employ 2 to 3 people when it opens. And you can see here in this image just what Trojan Storage looks like while under construction. The next facility staff looked at was Secure Space, and this facility is located right next to Trojan Storage on a 9.25 acre site. This self-storage facility occupies a former office building that was constructed with the capacity to employ 615 people, and now only employs 3 people as a self-storage facility. And then you can see here just how large of a building Secure Space occupies. Another finding by staff was that self-storage uses are inconsistent with multiple city objectives. First, self-storage is inconsistent with the city's general plan and zoning code because it is indicated that industrial zones are intended for industrial parks that provide employment, diversify the city's economy, and help facilitate a jobs to housing ratio. Another area of inconsistency is with the Economic Development Strategic Plan, which recommends the city focus on several target industries, which all happen to be permitted in the LM and M1 zones and compete with self-storage for space in those zones. Next, staff reached out to other Ventura County cities to see how they're taking on the self-storage development trend and found that Thousand Oaks last fall approved a self-storage zoning ordinance amendment of their own that placed strict regulations on self-storage facilities, which you can see some of their provisions on the screen. Staff also checked with Ventura, Oxnard, Moore Park, and Simi Valley on if they planned on adding any restrictions to their current regulations on self-storage facilities and found that none of those cities had any plans on adding onto their existing standards. With that said, though, staff was recently contacted by the city of Fillmore about more information about the self-storage zoning ordinance being considered tonight. Another area of staff research was nonconforming land uses. Just to provide a quick definition, a nonconforming land use is a land use that is no longer permitted in the zone it resides, but existed before the use was prohibited. Staff identified under the current nonconforming use standards in the municipal code that 75% of self-storage facilities in the city would have to close within 5 years. However, the proposed ordinance being considered contains a provision that allows existing self-storage facilities to remain in use beyond 5 years, but they would not be allowed to expand. The proposed ordinance being considered includes a definition of self-storage, removes self-storage as a permitted use in the LM and M1 zone, lists self-storage as an expressively prohibited use in the LM and M1 zones. It adds clarifying language indicating self-storage as a permitted use in the SC and M2 zones, and it allows for existing self-storage facilities made non-conforming to remain in use beyond 5 years, however, they may not be expanded. The proposed ordinance being considered previously appeared in front of the Economic Development and Land Use Committee, where it received support to move forward, and that Planning Commission, the Camarillo Planning Commission, approved a resolution recommending approval to City Council the proposed self-storage zoning ordinance amendment. Staff finds that the proposed ordinance is exempt from CEQA under the sections listed on the screen. Staff recommends the Camarillo City Council finds the proposed ordinance exempt from CEQA and request a further reading of the title of the ordinance and waive further reading and introduce the ordinance approving the self-storage zoning ordinance amendment. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you, Brett. Do we have questions? Mr. Kildee?
Yeah. So with the ordinance, it would remove a self-storage in the LM and the M1 zones. Would they still be able to build a self-storage in other zones that aren't designated as this?
After this ordinance goes into effect, self-storage facilities would only be allowed to be constructed in 2 zones in the city, which would be the service commercial zone and the general manufacturing zone.
And is it fair to say that through the years that these self-storage units have grown in size from what they used to be?
Well, self-storage is obviously a growing industry, especially during the pandemic. Cities everywhere have been seeing lots of inquiries for these. As far as we're concerned, the size of the ones out here have been pretty consistent, regardless of what year they were constructed. However, it is a possibility they could be getting bigger with time.
Is it somewhat typical in the industry to just employ a few amount of people? I mean, in other words, probably an on-site manager and a few other folks. Is that kind of typical of the industry?
That is correct. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics found that the average self-storage facility nationwide only employs 3.5 employees.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? I have one quick question. For those that are already in existence and they can extend beyond the 5 years in perpetuity?
That's correct.
Okay. That was my only question. Thank you. Mr. Tremblay.
No, thanks for raising that, Madam Mayor, because I had a conversation with staff about that particular issue. But they would remain a they would remain a non-conforming use, but they could not be expanded. So for example, in year 6, so there's no possibility of expansion if we were to approve this. I just want to be sure that
Thank you.
we understood. Okay, thanks.
Okay, with no further questions, this is a public hearing. I will open the public hearing. Would anybody like to be heard on this? Have you filled out a card, or come on up and we can get you a card afterwards? Hi, please state your name. You have 3 minutes. At the 2-minute mark, you'll hear a beep and the time will change color to yellow, but you can keep going.
Thank you. My name is David Edward. I'm with Ojai Oil Company, and we do business as Golden State Storage in Southern California and Nevada. We have a facility here in town. I have submitted some public comments online, which will work their way through to you. I'd just like to point out that during the pandemic, we were considered an essential industry, and we stayed open, which is one of the public comments I made. And we are pretty essential for a lot of small businesses which are starting up, because low-cost, short-term storage is essential for them. So you might not see them as a direct employer, but they're a secondary employer of many, a facilitator for many, many companies which work out of them, not on-site, but using them for storage purposes. We also employ other people in the local area. We employ people who look after the landscaping, and you were mentioning about dead grass a little while ago. It's very important for a business like ours to look good. We use painters, people supplying technical equipment to the offices, elevators, roofs, all this kind of stuff. And it's also a very good buffer to have between a freeway and residential or other people, because it's a quiet use, but it also blocks off the noise of traffic and the fumes and things like that. The other thing you want to consider is whether or not you want a bunch of RVs parked in people's drives. If you take away the storage, and by the way, the reason we're full is because so many people want it. The average house size is becoming smaller and smaller. There's lots of vacant industrial buildings, there's lots of vacant retail, and there's lots of vacant office buildings. But we're still being used because home sizes are smaller, and people need the storage periodically when they're moving in, when they're moving out. If you've got a vibrant community, you have people moving in and out the whole time. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Okay, hearing none, I will close the public hearing. And do we have any comments from council members, or what is the will? Someone like to make a motion?
I'll go first.
Okay.
We've had a long discussion about this over several years, and we've also had a business strategic plan that took us several months to implement here, and it said a lot of things, but one of the things it said that we hope to be able to attract biotech firms, firms that can employ a number of people here, and we don't have a lot of zoning left to accommodate those in the future if and when they decide to hopefully consider Camarillo. In any way, shape, and form, this is not singling out self-storage at all. They provide a necessary and a useful business in our city. From my point of view, though, they're getting bigger and bigger, and that's a credit to their success. I credit them for that success. But to allow this to keep going on like it is and not have the available land for something that could enhance our city, I think would be something that we'd be remiss if we didn't deal with it. It still allows self-storage in other jurisdictions in the city here. Our hope is that, this will attract future businesses in the city that will employ a number of people here. I always ask myself, why are we doing this? What's the issue here? Why do we have to do this? And hopefully I've attempted to lay out the game plan here and the strategy and the back history of what we're trying to accomplish here. Again, the limited amount of space that we've got, and hopefully the benefit in the long term for the city with the various reasons that I've articulated here. So with that, I can support this.
Does anybody else have comments?
I appreciate your comments very much. I agree that self-storage is a very important business, but that said, you don't want a situation where the city is oversubscribed with storage facilities. And that would be inconsistent with the city's economic development strategic plan, with which the city has really focused its efforts in the last several years. So it's simply a matter of balance. So with that, Madam Mayor, may I ask the city attorney, there are 3 recommendations. Could I request if it's all right, request a reading of the title of the ordinance and then move items 1 and 3? Is that good enough?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay, so Madam Mayor, may I request a reading of the title of the ordinance?
Yes, this is ordinance number 2013, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Camarillo, California, amending the Camarillo Municipal Code regarding self-storage facilities.
I move staff recommendations 1 and 3 respectively.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Without further discussion, go ahead and vote, please. And that passes unanimously. Okay, that will bring us to our second public hearing, which is the annual update to the user fee schedule. Mark Uribe, you're going to handle this one.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm Mark Uribe, Finance Director for the city. And this item tonight is the annual update of the city's user fee schedule. User fee, excuse me. User fees may not exceed the estimated reasonable cost of providing the service. And in 2019-2020 fiscal year, the city conducted a comprehensive user fee study, including a detailed review of time estimates, direct labor costs, and overhead costs to determine the total cost of providing such services. A comprehensive study is conducted every 5 years as a best practice. Now, for the interim years, we do a cost adjustment, which is what we're bringing tonight. A cost adjustment is applied pursuant to City Council Budget and Fiscal Policy 3.01 to reflect year-over-year changes in direct labor costs. This year, staff is recommending a 9.73% increase to user fees to reflect the year-over-year changes in direct labor costs. At tonight's public hearing, the City Council will consider whether to adopt the recommended fee adjustments. The required legal notices have been published for this public hearing. Any development-related fee increases would become effective 60 days following the action, while any increased non-development-related fees would become effective immediately. There were 4 new fees added in the last year, and these are not subject to the annual adjustment. So that concludes my brief presentation. I'm available for questions. Otherwise, this is a public hearing item.
Thank you, Mr. Uribe. Do we have any questions? Mr. Kildee.
Yeah, Mr. Uribe. I was wondering if you could maybe expand for me, how did we land on the 9.73%?
That is the year-over-year increase in direct labor costs. So the way we determine the cost is we do an estimate of time required to perform the service, and then the employee involved in providing that service has a direct labor cost involved. So we multiply the number of hours by the hourly rate.
And that equation has not really changed over time. In other words, that's been kind of the standard that we've used for several years here.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. This is a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing. Would anyone like to speak to the council? Okay, seeing nobody come forward, I will close the public hearing.
I recommend the approval of the suggested action.
I have a motion
I'll second.
and a second. Without further discussion, please vote. And that passes unanimously as well. Okay, this is going to bring us down to item L, which is the resolution authorizing the defeasance of the PFA water revenue bonds. Mr. Uribe, you're handling this as well.
Yes, thank you. This item is to consider the defeasance or repayment of the outstanding 2019 water revenue bonds. Several factors have come together over the last 2 years, creating pressure on the water system's financial condition. I have a brief presentation here. In the background, the factors that come together, drought impacts being the number one. For 2020 through 2022 was the driest 3-year period ever on record for California. Governor Newsom declared a state of emergency in March of 2022. Mandated conservation measures restricted water usage with a goal of 20 to 30% reduction. And those reductions meant reduced water operating revenue by a significant amount. Second factor was the capital infrastructure projects. We had 2 of the city's 4 wells under rehabilitation, and by taking those wells offline, it resulted in the need to purchase more imported water, which comes at a higher cost than if we were able to produce it ourselves. The third factor was the increased O&M expenses. We just went through a record inflation year, an average of 8% in 2022. That was a 40-year high. The background on the bonds. In August of 2019, the city issued $11.8 million of water revenue bonds. The bonds are payable from net revenues of the city's water system, and operating revenue minus operating costs equals the net revenue. The terms of the bond require the city to set rates to yield gross revenues equal to the operating and maintenance costs plus 125% of the annual debt service on the bonds. And that's what we come to know as the debt coverage ratio requirement. And that amount is about $1 million. So as I mentioned, those recent impacts to the water system caused the net revenues to fall below the coverage ratio requirement in fiscal year 21-22. The recommended action tonight is to defease or repay the 2019 water bonds. The debt coverage ratio requirement, the 125% coverage means that the operating revenues must exceed operating expenses by 125% of the annual debt service on the bonds. The annual debt service on the bonds in any one year was about $800,000, so 125% of that is $1 million. With the continued impacts and no rate increases over the last fiscal year, the requirement will not be met for 22-23, the fiscal year that just ended. In order to meet the bond covenant by June 30 of 2024, in this current fiscal year, it would require significant increases in water rates to generate sufficient revenue coverage. The consequences of failing to meet the requirement in fiscal year 23-24 include potential 2019 water bond rating downgrade, an overall city rating downgrade, the city as an issuer of any future debt. Any of those downgrades would result in higher interest rates on future bonds, and future bonds may not even be rated. That would be considered junk bond status, where we may not even be able to sell bonds because we wouldn't have a rating. And the most extreme consequence potential is legal action by institutional bondholders who are buying our bonds with the promise to their investors that they're going to be paid. And again, meeting the bond covenant would require rates as high as 28 to 40% on January 1st to generate sufficient revenue coverage by June 30 of 2024. most of that being on January 1st, we would only have 6 months of revenue to have to recover to the level by June 30 of 2024. So the options for fiscal year 23-24 are to keep the bonds, again, meaning that we must meet the coverage requirement by June 30 of 2024, would require a 40% rate increase on January 1, 2024. During the Utilities Committee meetings, we also discussed options of a partial repayment on the bonds or a restructuring of the bonds, but either of those two options would still result in 28% to 35% rate increases. Under any scenario, that would be keeping the bonds. The second option is to defease or repay the bonds, about $10.6 million. What that does is eliminate the coverage requirement that was driving the need for extreme rate increases. Now, it does draw down on water reserves, but it allows the flexibility to implement lower rate increases and build back the reserves over time. The water utility reserves at July 1 of 2023 were estimated to be about $19.2 million. If the bonds were to be paid off, $10.6 million, the remaining water reserves would be approximately $8.6 million. So that concludes the brief presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Mr. Tennyson.
A quick municipal bond for dummies question for you, Mark. The difference between defeasance, or actually, we're not buying back the bonds. The bonds will go to maturity. So how does defeasance work versus us just buying the bonds back, and what are the benefits of that?
Right, good question. The term defeasance is a legal term that says we're setting aside money sufficient enough to pay the bonds as they come due. The way most bond issuances are structured is the bonds have certain dates that you are able to call the bonds, and those may be set into the future. But we don't want to wait for those dates. We want to pay them off now. So for all intents and purposes, the city is relieved of that debt and is no longer on the books. Most importantly, we no longer are subject to that coverage ratio requirement of the bonds.
Just a quick follow-up. So what we're doing with this 10 million plus is we're buying government securities that will go into an escrow account, and that escrow account going forward is what pays the service on the debt.
Correct.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Mr. Kildee.
Yeah, Mark, the difference from the 11.8 million and the, I believe it was what, 10.6 million, the difference of that is somewhat what Councilmember Tennyson has said, but the difference is that the amount of money that we paid down on that, or what is it?
That would be the cost to repay the bonds.
That would be the cost. So obviously, they were issued at a higher number, but because of what we've already paid down, it's basically about, what, 10.6 million to pay them off?
Correct.
Okay. All right. And if we do this, Mark, will there be any other debt that we'll have to incur, or would this wipe the slate clean?
That would wipe this current debt issue clean.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have other questions?
Just comments.
I have one quick question. Aside from the fact that we would have to pay out of our water reserves, are there any downsides to defeasance of the bonds?
I think one downside could possibly be that when the bonds that we issued in 2019 were at a lower interest rate. If we needed to reissue bonds immediately, it would be at a higher interest rate. So that would be one potential.
Okay.
But the advantages of being able to propose lower rate increases by far offsets that.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. If we don't have any more questions and we have comments. Who
Sure.
wants to start?
Yeah.
Utility Committee?
Yeah, no, I mean, yes. Thank you, Tony, for the many, many meetings that we've had in discussing this in the Utilities Committee. And we wanted to bring, the full information to the council. I think we were hit with a perfect storm, with the impact of the drought and the need for the capital infrastructure projects, and then also the increase in our expenses. And I'm grateful that we are a very financially, fiscally responsible city, and that we are financially stable. And I know that that is not something that other cities have that luxury. And I think it is important to continue to be responsible and to meet our debt coverage ratio requirement. Our city's history, as we know, has not always been as stable as it is now. And I owe it to the many people who sat in this chair and in these chairs who did this work to get us to where we are now. And I do support the repayment of the bonds, and that would be the option 2 for me. And that is my comments.
Comment?
Mr. Kildee?
Just one quick comment. Martinez Bravo, I think, hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways that, and I commend the subcommittee's very due diligence on this. I'm sure it took several iterations and many hours, but we've always been very protective of our bond ratings in the city, too. So it is really great that we are in a city that we're in a position to do this. I don't know how it's going to go, but, this is why you save money for times like this. And again, I think it's really great that we're in a position that we're able to do something like this. And, a lot of thanks to a lot of people that put us here, too. So those are my comments.
Mr. Tremblay?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I agree with much of what Councilmember Martinez Bravo has said, and I really appreciate the record should reflect that the Utilities Committee has spent hours and hours on this, and I want to thank you, Mark, and finance staff, our rate consultant, our financial consultant, and bond counsel, all of whom have been involved in this. It's interesting. In my experience up here, you rarely see two items so intertwined as this item and the next item coming up. And the next item coming up is the elephant in the room, figuratively. I agree, we have had a perfect storm. I think there is no question in my mind right now that the right move is to defease the bonds and to do so now. And I know that the Utilities Committee, Councilmember Martinez Bravo and I are in agreement on that. It's the next item where we want to have the council weigh in because there are some different approaches that we have to talk about. But I would say when you look at if you could go to slide 6 on the PowerPoint, I want to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, under defeasing, that does eliminate the debt service coverage requirement. However, it draws down on our water reserves, and it allows lower rate increases to build back reserves over time. But I have to say, the staff report indicates, and I quote, the defeasance of the 2019 bonds will allow the city to consider lower water rate increases by eliminating the requirement in the 2019 bonds that the city maintain water rates sufficient to provide 125% debt service coverage in each fiscal year. Fine. Defease the bonds, eliminate the debt service requirement. But, and this is a very large elephant in the room, we're going to be required to increase water rates because of our water plan that you're going to hear about in item M. And I don't want anybody in the public to be confused by that final bullet on number 2 and just read allow lower rate increases. The fact of the matter is that the rate increases that we're going to have to put in place because of the defeasance of this bond are going to be significant. And they will be, depending on which way the council goes on this, sustained over a period of years. So that is the elephant in the room. And I guess I just ask this question now. If I were a resident and I were reading the staff report, they might ask the following question. Okay, council's going to defease the bonds. We get rid of the 125% debt service coverage requirement. Then why does the city have to increase the rates at all under item M? Because the bonds are paid off and you have no debt service coverage ratio anymore. And I think the answer to that, Mark, would it not be, and actually if it's okay, Madam Mayor, I'll frame it in the form of a question to Mark. Isn't the answer to that question that the bonds are just one component of a finance structure? We have operating costs, we have capital costs for our water system, and those in and of themselves require rate increases in addition to rebuilding, if you go to the next slide, our water system fund. Is that an accurate way to think of it?
Correct. Many, many more components that go into this water system's financial plan. Inflation is a large one as well.
So I don't want to delay any more getting to item M because that's the real, I think that's the one that's going to deserve a lot of discussion tonight. So if you're okay with it, Madam Mayor, I will make a motion to approve recommendations 1 and 2 in the staff report.
And I will second.
Okay. Any further discussion? Please vote. And that also passes unanimously. Okay. So we're 3 minutes before our 6 o'clock public, but I believe we have a few cards? Or one card? Okay. So we'll go ahead and start, and if anybody comes in afterwards, they'll still be able to speak. Arthur Munoz.
Hello,
Mr.
hello.
Hello, you have 3 minutes to speak.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to, like last time, to rely on your intuition, city council members, because what I have to say is that based on the miracle of the Lord God Almighty, God has made me a competent, cogent, and coherent man. I shared with you the last meeting that you had that right out here at the Constitution Park, I was given a meal by the homeless officer of the Ventura County Sheriff's Department, Jason something or other, and I got horribly sick with one of the worst sicknesses I've ever had. I contend it was an attempt on my life. I had a raging temperature. I had like a pneumonia. I was sick for 4 days. On the 4th day, I was parked on Arneal Road by McDonald's, and on the 4th day, I had a surreal dream in which the Holy Spirit was there telling me that God loved me, that God loved me. I didn't want to wake up from said dream. But when I finally woke up from said dream, I realized that the fever was gone. So whoever tried to kill me, there was a miracle of God that God saved me on that day, I believe. And the Holy Spirit had to address me with that. My problems arise from a 1990 case in the Ventura County Superior Court, in case number CR 25901. It involves possibly the worst Brady versus Maryland United States Supreme Court case law violations, wherein the Superior Court unconscionably suppressed my defense evidence on the case and subsequently sent me to state prison for 10 years of my life wrongfully. Now they're trying to suppress that fact, and they don't want me to reveal that, and they're going to the extent of doing what I'm now sharing with you today. I had a bag of coins in my vehicle. God had blessed me recently with a bag of Sacagawean coins. One of them was a $100,000 Sacagawean presidential coin that I got at the bank when I asked him for $200 worth of Sacagawean coins. Recently, somebody stole that from me. They replaced the brilliant and the resilient and the shimmering gold hue of coins, Sacagawean coins that I had, with a rusty, dingy, dirty, and regular bag of Sacagawean coins without the value of, I'm not sure which ones were gold and which ones weren't the one that I had, but it was recently stolen from me and replaced, and I can't get any kind of, of course I did a police report, and I've done several police reports just to document and to put this before, somebody, but I have nowhere to turn.
Thank you.
And that's why I'm here to establish what I have to say. There again, I hope you can rely on your intuition, because I know that the Lord will reveal what I'm saying to you is absolutely true.
Thank
One
you
more
for your
thing I have to
comments, Mr.
say
Munoz.
is that the Ventura County Superior Court, in conjunction with the Ventura County
Mr. Munoz, your 3 minutes are over. I'm sorry.
Sheriff's Department, are trying to make me appear like I'm not of sound mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Givens. Mr. Givens, you have 3 minutes to speak.
Thanks. I don't think it'll take 3 minutes. I've lived in Old Town Camarillo for over 60 years. I have a couple properties there. Last week, I received this notice in the mail. I don't know if you're aware of these. This is from your Code Enforcement Department. They're doing a proactive inspection in my neighborhood. Is anybody aware of this? No? Okay, you are. Will they be doing them annually, monthly, weekly? Do you know? Nobody knows. You can't make comment. But at least I've notified you. I can tell you that I'm concerned because on this, it says that trash receptacles stored in public view. My properties were built in the mid-50s, before this was a city. There is no side yard. There is no place to store the trash cans, trash appliances out of public view. There's just no way to achieve that. So I'm at a loss at why my neighborhood's about to be invaded by code inspectors. I find it alarming. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Yes.
If I may make a quick comment, we did speak about, to the speaker, we did speak about these cards earlier in the meeting, I believe before you arrived, and we spoke about the intent of what code compliance is doing, because among other things, during the pandemic, there really has been a lull in code compliance activity, and this is, I guess this is why it's called proactive. Anyway, code compliance is coming back up, but what I would do is ask the city manager or appropriate city staff to meet with the speaker regarding that particular issue with regard to trash receptacles in terms of whether or not there's adequate storage outside of public view. So I would ask that city staff make themselves available to the speaker on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to speak before the council? Okay, seeing no more speaker cards and nobody coming forward, we're going to reconvene. Sen.
Yes. I'd like to reconvene the CAMSAN meeting.
And then that brings us to item M. Mr. Uribe, you're on the hook again for the 2023 water and sewer rate study discussion.
Thank you. I'll have some help on this one.
Oh, good.
Thank you, members of the council, members of the Camarillo Sanitary District. I just want to make a few introductory comments. First of all, I want to make clear that this is a discussion item on water and sewer rates. Discussion item only. There will be no formal action taken tonight. There is a planned public hearing in October, which will be the time and place for City Council and Sanitary Board members to consider rates. and the public will have multiple opportunities to provide comment and input between now and then. The purpose of tonight's discussion is to give an overview of the rate study process and for staff to receive direction on the next step, which would be an authorization to commence a Proposition 218 process at the August council meeting. The Proposition 218 notification of proposed rates would begin a 45-day period leading up to the planned public hearing in October. The rate study is a coordinated effort between Finance and Public Works working with the city's rate consultants, Reftelis Financial Consultants. This current study involved several extenuating circumstances, some that I mentioned in the previous item, that have caused an extended period of review time. The rate study background on the agenda, rate study background, water rates, the Camarillo Sanitary District we'll refer to as CSD from now on, the bill impacts and rate comparisons to other cities, and then a discussion on drought rates, and then a review of the schedule. The purpose of a rate study is to assess the costs necessary to operate and maintain the utility system. That includes operating and maintenance costs, capital infrastructure costs, debt service costs, and reserve levels, or maintaining reserve level targets. It involves developing a financial plan, which includes projections on demand, drought impacts, evaluating sources of supply. We now have the third source of supply. Previously, it was only groundwater and imported water. Now we have the desalter water as a source. We look at either building up or maintaining reserve levels, which we mentioned in the previous item. And all of that comes together to determine rates necessary to meet those projected costs. The rate study also is very important in providing support for proposed rates as part of the Proposition 218 process. The progress of the rate study today, we've had 8 meetings with the Utilities Committee going back to October of 2022. We reviewed the process for setting rates. We reviewed the cost assumptions, the operating and capital costs that go into the rate model. We reviewed the usage assumptions, which was a large component of this particular round of rate study. And we reviewed the preliminary results, and with discussions at the utility committee level, we looked at several alternative scenarios. And tonight, we're bringing forth the committee recommendations. The first one we went through in the last item was the repayment of the 2019 water bonds, because it is very closely tied into this discussion. And the recommendation for this discussion tonight is a full council discussion on the proposed rate scenarios. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Kostwick from Reftelis Financial Consultants to go through the rate study.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening, Mayor and Council. Kevin Kostic from Reftelis. So we're going to start, this is all water related, the next several slides. So long-range financial plan drivers on the rate side. We have reduced water sales revenues. So we've had a multi-year drought. We had COVID. We had changes between our different customer classes, mandated conservation. And so we've kind of reset the baseline coming out of the last fiscal year. Mark also touched on changes in source of supply. So we now have the desalter producing water. We have a third source of supply, which is kind of our intermediate cost source. Along with that, though, we have wells that are in rehab. So we have kind of timing issues of production of raw groundwater, new desalter water, and then purchase water that has to bridge the gap. And those sources change through time. So that supply mix changes over time. And we're looking out over a long-term 10-year horizon. Changes in O&M expenses, inflation finally coming down, but we've had a sustained period of historic inflation, and that has put pressure across all of our operating and maintenance expenses. We also have future personnel and administrative costs to contend with. That inflationary pressure is not just on the O&M side, it's on CIP, the capital program as well. Again, sustained inflation last year in construction cost inflation. That's now come back down towards historic norms, about 3%. We have added to the capital program, though. So when we look to the prior study, we've added about $21 million in additional projects Now, that's additional projects or project costs. And for some of those projects, we will be looking to bond in the future. And so we have this discussion about repaying and retiring the existing bonds, but we will need to borrow in the future for some of these capital projects to be able to mitigate REIT impacts. I've touched on some of this, but again, we look out over a long horizon, a 10-year planning horizon, to see what's on the horizon as far as, again, changes in O&M from changes in cost structure and water supply sources, the capital program, the timing of all those things. Because even though we're talking about a 2-year rate adoption, we don't want to lose sight of the train that might be coming in years 6 through 10. So again, just 2 years is what we're proposing this cycle, but looking out again over a 10-year horizon. And this was touched on as well, the bonds are only one component of the financial plan and of the rate study itself. So that, again, maybe I'll turn the phrase, the elephant in the room. That's the elephant in the room kind of in the first year of the rate study. But as we look out through years, say 5 through 10, that we have other pressures, and again, related to both operating costs and capital costs. Our water CIP, so we're showing the fiscal year that just concluded, and then looking out over a 10-year horizon, a couple projects in orange that have been removed from the schedule. Everything else, and it says green there, though it doesn't look green on the screen, have been kind of modified along the CIP process, the annual process that I know has been adopted recently. Some of the larger projects are bolded there for you. We have some pump station improvements. We have completion of desalter components, well replacements in a few years' time, which is important for both producing local water and offsetting future operating costs. So on the order of $50 million in capital spending when we look over that entire horizon. So again, we have our revenue base, which has felt pressure from reduced water use, and then we have our costs, operating costs, current and future capital costs, the debt service issue, and then funding reserves. And so how do we sustainably fund that over a long term? Well, in working with the Utilities Committee over the last 6 to 8 months, what we have for you tonight are 3 scenarios. The top table, scenario 1 is repaying the bonds and not having to borrow outside of the utility fund. What that would require are 12% rate increases in January of 2024, and then again in July of 2024, followed by, for planning purposes, in year 3, another 12% increase, and then back towards CPI, 3% thereafter. The second scenario repays the bonds, just like in scenario 1, but now we're looking to borrow from the general fund a significant loan of $25 million. Now, what that allows for is a more modest increase in those first 2 years, 8%, followed by a couple of additional 8%, and then 6%, so higher in the out years because now we're borrowing, we have to repay even internally, so our cash needs increase in the out years. So lower in the first several years, larger in the out years. And then scenario 3 is the intermediate, so still looking to borrow from the general fund for some of our capital projects in the near term that would require a $15 million loan and 2 years of 9% increases, and then again for planning purposes, 9% for 2 years thereafter, and then 6%. So those are our 3 scenarios. That's in the top table shown in percentage terms relative to our existing rates. The bottom table is showing what that translates into a bill impact for a typical customer. So single-family residential using 12 units of water per month, that current bill, $52 and change, and then you see the relative bill impacts between the different scenarios, with, again, scenario 2 having the least impact in the first 2 years, scenario 1 the most impact, but then when we look out over the 5 to 10 year horizon, scenario 1, though it's front-loaded, actually has the least impact cumulatively. So I'll walk you through a bit more of these scenarios in detail. So what this is showing first in the table is the implementation month and the implementation year, the relative increase to rates in percentage terms, and then proposed debt would be additional borrowing. So we had this conversation about retiring debt, but we'll be looking to borrow in the future for certain projects in order to minimize rate increases. on the order of $38 million over the next 5+ years in this first scenario. And the charts on the right-hand side of the slide to orient you, top chart is showing our projected ending cash balances that we model. So when we look at the unrestricted reserves within the water enterprise relative to our designated reserve policy target, that would be the green line. So relatively thin in the next several fiscal years, but building back up to our reserve target over the long term when we look out over 10 years. And then the bottom chart showing in the bars the increases themselves, but importantly the lines showing our minimum debt service coverage requirement of 125% or 1.25 times net revenues. The gray is the minimum, the blue is the calculated. So we always want to have sufficient clearance over that gray minimum. Scenario 2, similarly, same table, same chart, with the exception of we've added in the general fund loan column to the table on the left-hand side. So now what we're showing is that borrowing of $25 million, and then as it's currently structured, a repayment commencing 5 years after the borrowing and being repaid over the course of 10 years. And that's why you see negative values in that general fund loan column in the last 4 years. Scenario 3, as I mentioned, is kind of the intermediate, still a general fund loan borrowing, but smaller, $15 million. Again, in this first fiscal year, and then repaid 5 years, beginning 5 years after the borrowing. And so all of these scenarios, again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve sufficient debt coverage for future borrowings and sustain our reserves at policy levels over the long term while minimizing rate impacts.
And I'll jump in here. When we're talking about considering a general fund loan component, we'd want to know how much money do we have in the general fund. And this slide says as of excuse me, the beginning of the fiscal year, we had about $80.8 million of general fund balance. But then we have to separate out certain components of that fund balance that have already been spoken for. The non-spendable, $554,000, are basically items that we cannot spend for any other purpose. Similarly, the restricted money, $4.9 million, is money that we cannot spend for any other purpose. That $4.9 million is the ARPA funds. We have the money in the bank, but we are spending it over a period of, spreading it over the 4-year period for the grant monies. So while it's sitting, the cash is sitting in the general fund, we can't spend it on anything else other than what we committed to spend on for the ARPA funds, that is Sheriff Services. Then the yellow highlighted line, we'll get to the details on the next slide. $71.4 million of the commitments are the monies that are council's discretion, and we'll get to those details on the next slide. The $400,000 assigned, that represents encumbrances that are going to carry over into the next year, basically purchases that have been made but have not been paid for yet. And that brings us down to a bottom line of approximately $3.5 million projected unassigned fund balance at June 30, 2023. That's the fiscal year that just ended a couple of weeks ago, and this is a very preliminary estimate. We still have a lot of closing entries and bills to pay for the fiscal year 2022-23, and we have closing procedures that go on through the month of August. So this is just based on our early estimates as some type of surplus for the fiscal year 22-23 that has been built into that number. So as far as the commitment, $71.4 million. Here's the breakdown. $30.4 million is the council reserve goal policy of 50% of general fund expenditures. And then the next lines are council discretion over the years that have been established. $5.4 million for economic development, $10 million for natural disaster recovery, $200,000 for the Cam Springs debris barrier remediation, $8 million for the PVRPD Community and Senior Center, then $9 million for capital improvement projects. That is primarily the bridge project and the intersection, Las Posas bridge intersection, the drainage. Yeah, that's the majority of, the rest of it is the pavement program for 3 years, years 3 through 5. We know the pavement program at a clip of $4 million per year is going to be happening over the next 5 years for the 5-year CIP. So we wanted to set aside the general fund component of that in these commitments. And then the 4.5 million, similarly, it's for planned facilities improvement projects over the next 5 years, 3 to 5 years. The continuum of care, 3.8 million, is committed for any type of homeless activities that may come. And then that's a total of 40.985 million, bringing, with the council reserve goal, 71.4 million total committed fund balance. And as a reminder, these commitments are set at council's discretion, can be adjusted at any time. Now, I'll pause there for any questions. Well, let me go one more slide, I'm sorry. So a general fund loan in the scenarios reduces pressure on near-term rates, but increases in the out years. The loan amount based on the total CIP expenditures projected in fiscal years 2024 through 2026. Scenarios 2 and 3 that involve a general fund loan show more uniform rate increases compared to scenario 1. And the groundwater desalter supply source is beneficial to both near-term and long-term rates. So then I will pause there and maybe go back to the 3 scenarios if we want to take a look at those again, to have some discussion on those 3 scenario options.
Do we have questions? Mr. Tennyson.
Just a quick follow-up. The scenario 2 and 3 that require the general fund loan, that's not all at one time, correct? I mean, you showed us our reserves now, but that will be in future fiscal years where it would be staggered, the loan to the water fund, correct?
Correct. That's a good question, because by paying off the bonds that we did on the previous option, using general fund loan money to pay for future projects will happen as needed. As projects progress, as projects get ready to take place, that's when we would look at how much of the general fund money we would need for those specific projects.
Thank you.
Mr. Kildee?
Yeah, Mark, if we get down to scenario 2 and 3, and one of them requests more money from the general fund, and I know these are preliminary figures, but if we're down to, and I understand it's going to be over time, but if we're down to about 3.5 million as a balance in that, will that give us enough money to cover what we need to cover with the general fund?
I would say it's going to depend on how the projects progress and how much money we have at that point in time. That's where the flexibility of using general fund money comes into play, as opposed to a bond issuance where we would have all of the money up front and we would need to spend it. We have the flexibility of picking and choosing when we want to use that general fund money.
Okay, and did the committee and staff look at all of the potential scenarios that we could level off these rate of increases? Because I think it's important that when we develop the desalter, there are many folks out in the community and whatnot that were saying, you know, it's going to be less expensive water for us to purchase that than if we purchased our water from Met, which is true. However, I know that staff and myself and a lot of others here were saying, well, what it's going to do, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that it's going to level off the increases here with that, because the water is going to be less expensive than what we'd have to do if we go out and bought it. Is that still accurate?
I would say that that is still true. Now, some things have obviously changed. We've added capital projects. We have the issue with the bond coverage on the existing loan, which is precipitating larger increases in the near term. But just, you know, if we just compare desalter water with purchased water, I mean, that differential is very real still. I mean, I think we're on the order of $1,600 to $1,700 an acre foot when we purchase water. With the desalter, even with the capital in, I think we might be at $1,300 or $1,400 an acre foot. And you have this credit, this local resource program credit coming back to you for, I think the term is 20 years. So there's still a very real differential between the cost of those two sources of supply. Now, we have lots of other things operating in the background, obviously pressures on O&M, additional capital, et cetera. So, you know, we snap a line and a point in time for a rate study and say this is what the next 10 years looks like. Well, now we're, 3, 5, 7 years beyond that. We have obviously a new normal with water demands. We have, we keep referring to inflationary pressures. But if we just kind of myopically think about the cost of purchase water over the long term and the cost of desalter water, and then the relative increases between the two. So we expect the desalter increases to be on the order of 3% a year. Cayugas increases are on the order of 5% a year. So over time, that differential may in fact grow.
And are you confident that we've run all of the equations here and we've landed on, well, basically these three scenarios? Is that pretty much where we are, what we've done, and what we're faced with?
Yes, the committee can speak to this. I know Mark alluded to it, that we went through, oh my gosh, I don't know, a dozen scenarios, iterations of these, some additional ones where it looked like we were going to either modify the debt, repay only part of the debt. So yes, I think we've been upside down on this, looking everywhere, a dozen different iterations of water scenarios. And these are we'll call them the three finalists after 6-8 months of work.
I would add to that through all of the Utilities Committee discussions, we also took a very focused look at the planned CIP projects and where we could make adjustments if possible on the necessary projects, the timing of the necessary projects, so that involved additional scenarios in some shifting of timing on the projects.
And maybe I'll add just one more thing here, because I think it's important to say, or to acknowledge, that we had one set of assumptions at one point in time and one set of assumptions now. If we did not have the desalter and we were looking at these scenarios, back of the envelope, I think these increases would be on the order of twice as high, because we would be relying on imported water going forward with those higher costs, higher increases, still looking to borrow for capital projects in the future, which means we need higher increases to be able to service that debt. So absent the desalter, we'd be looking at significantly higher increases.
Sure.
I have a lot of questions, but then
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My general comments for scenario 1, 2, and 3, I'm really looking not just short-term, but long-term in terms of, which one produces the least negative impact, and how can we continue to maintain our system responsibly. I'm concerned about borrowing from the general fund, and you're right. I mean, we had so many scenarios play out. I think I was dreaming about some of these scenarios. And so for me, I just think it's important to invest now and to maintain our system. And for that reason, I would be more in support of the first scenario. Those are my comments.
Mr. Tremblay?
Madam Mayor, can I combine questions with my comments?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right. First of all, there's been this is the elephant in the room. There has been an extraordinary amount of work done on this. Mark, I want to say again, thank you. Thank you to finance staff, Bobby, Kevin, our consultants. Thank you very, very much for all the work. Councilmember Martinez-Bravo, thank you we've been through an awful lot of meetings on this and discussed this at length. That said, I do have some questions that I just want to, I think we need to, in essence, Councilmember Martinez-Bravo and I are in agreement that we've got to move forward, obviously, in terms of in terms of rate increases. I think we just have a difference in the approach that we were talking about. So what we agreed on is, well, wait a minute, let's throw this open to the entire council, because we want to make sure everybody weighs in on this. But just to start with, we met back on February 2, we went through initial scenarios, met again on April 26th, we did additional options. We met again on May 17, and the important part of that is that under scenarios 1, 2, and 3, all of them, they all share things in common. First of all, we're going to defease the bonds. Secondly, there's no future debt service on the existing bonds. So we get rid of the debt, I want to say DSC, but we get rid of the debt service coverage ratio issue. And any one of those scenarios reduces cash, but it resolves the coverage issue. Now, that said, there are differing impacts based on these scenarios. And so one of the, I introduced the concept of, all right, well, we have general fund monies that the city could bring to bear on this. What would be, and we asked the committee, we asked staff to look at two different options, either a $25 million option or the $15 million option that you see in scenarios 2 and 3 respectively. And we discussed those scenarios at some length. In the water financial plan discussion, I'm trying to figure out which slide it is here. I think it's on, I don't know if you put it in here. You did, actually. It's slide 16. It says that a general fund loan reduces pressure on near-term rates, but increases out-year rate impacts. But isn't it also the case, because I noticed in the scenarios 1, 2, and 3, we also discussed scenario 3A in one of our recent meetings, and that didn't make its way into this presentation. But isn't it the fact that in terms of the out-year rate impacts, and by out years I'm defining fiscal years 2028 through 2032, Kevin, you could decrease the out-year impacts through increases in those years. For example, what it shows, and I'm not going to ask you to change slides, but 6% in those years, you could actually go to 7% in those years, and that would decrease the out-year impacts, correct? Because you'd be adding an additional percentage increase in the rates. So just because you have some increases on out-year rate, just because, what I'm trying to say is the increases in the out-year rate impacts depends upon what you do in those out years. You don't have to necessarily adhere to the scenarios under 2028 to 2032 that you put forward. Isn't that correct?
That's true. What we were trying to say here or express was when we borrow from the general fund, we have a repayment to make. And that repayment comes with its own, and this is on advice of your municipal advisor, that we treat it as though it's a borrowing, and we have some minimum debt service coverage effectively that we meet. So now we have, in scenario 1, we don't have a general fund loan,
right,
and so we don't have a cash outflow.
Right.
In scenarios 2 and 3, we have an additional cash outflow in those years, and so we've added to the cash needs at the same time where we've borrowed for future capital projects. And so those rates have to be higher relative to scenario 1 to achieve the same reserve level and debt service ratio.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Let me clarify something and make sure we get something out on the table right now. We spoke with bond counsel and financial consultants, financial analysts, extensively about this. And the question is, would a general fund loan engender a trustee or rating agency concern? And if I recall correctly, am I recalling correctly that the answer to that was no, provided that the loan is subordinate to future bonds?
Correct.
Right? Well, one thing that we have to make sure that's really important to this discussion in terms of outterm is in 2029 and 2030, we're looking at bond issuance somewhere in 2022 dollars of somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million, anywhere between $120 million to $135 million for the wastewater enterprise. So we have to keep, right? Am I correct on our timing? So that's another elephant in the room that we have to keep in mind. But let me ask about the capital improvement projects. With scenarios 2 and 3, I think those would be deferring. Let's go back to slide 9, by the way. Let's do that. We talked quite a bit about the Charter Oak Pump Station and the advanced metering infrastructure projects and what the impacts might be relative to those. And one of the questions was, well, could we defer, for example, the Charter Oak Pump Station project? And I believe, am I correct in thinking that the answer to that was no, we really can't, because we need better pumping in that geographic area, and that would in turn lead the city to having to buy less water or less imported water for that area of the city. Am I remembering that right, Mr. Klotzel?
That's correct.
Okay. So Charter Oak is kind of there. But in terms of the advanced metering infrastructure, or the AMI, in scenarios 2 and 3, that's excluded from 2 and 3, correct?
There's no deferral of AMI.
Oh, there's no deferral, because originally there was in the committee meetings.
Those were the alternate scenarios you mentioned, 2A, 2, and 3A. We had a 2A, 2B, 3A.
Right, which didn't make it here tonight.
Right. The ones that did not make it were any of the scenarios that considered delaying the AMI project.
Okay, so, and that actually segues perfectly. So understand that with respect to those scenarios, we would not be deferring the advanced metering infrastructure project, which is $10 million. There is a legitimate argument that can be made that perhaps we ought to defer that AMI project in light of other things going on, and that becomes important as we work through the scenarios and we look at what will happen in the future. I know Councilmember Martinez-Bravo and I had this discussion on AMI, and I think we had a difference of opinion on whether or not we ought to defer that AMI. I think, Martina, you were more of the mind, no, let's move forward with AMI. My point of view was, I want AMI, but I'm willing to put that off for some time in light of these other circumstances. So that's why, among other things, we wanted to kick it over to all 5 of us could have this discussion. I guess the next point is, with regard to the, could we put back on slide 10, which are the scenarios comparison? So here's the take-home message on this. If you look at the annual rate increases required, under scenario 1, it's 12% for each, and that's 12% fiscal year 24. That would be January of 24.
Correct.
And then July of 24. So you have a 24% increase in that 6-month period, followed by a 12% increase 12 months later. Correct, Kevin? Okay. As opposed to scenarios 2 and 3, which is a more, I guess I would say, incremental or smoothed out, if I can use that expression, version of what's going on between 2024 up through fiscal year 2024 up through fiscal year 2032. What is also important is isn't it, Kevin, is you're looking at that year 10, year 9, year 5, and year 10 cumulative for what the out impacts would be. For example, if you use scenario 1 at 54% aggregate increase, as opposed to scenarios 2 and 3, which vary between a 62 to 66% increase cumulatively, right? But that was my point with regard to the out years. you could smooth out the out years in 28 through 32 by doing a 7% increase as opposed to a 6% increase, and you would have an equivalent cumulative impact. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. There are borrowings that happen in the first, say, 5 to 7 years, and so you have to ensure that you have enough of a ramp rate in the revenue base for debt service in, say, years 5, 6, and 7. But yes, in broad terms, you're correct that generally you can balance by increasing the out years and reducing the earlier years.
Okay. So where we were ending, where Councilmember Martinez-Bravo and I were ending, so on May 17, we talked about this, and we talked about the three basic scenarios, and we asked staff, and they went away and did a marvelous job, because we asked specifically for updated estimates on water production, on water purchases, including the imported water purchases, Mr. Kildee, that you asked about a couple of minutes ago, and our water, and even more significantly, what we expected our water revenues to be, which is kind of like using a crystal ball, but you do the best you can. So there was a kind of a difference in approach. Do we go with scenario one with the 12%, three 12% increases, two of which are in a 6-month period, or do you utilize the general fund in one of the two scenarios? We agreed on the basic. We all agreed on the basic question, which was to repay the bonds, and we've done that. But the difference is in approach now for what we do now going forward, and I thought it was worthy of council discussion to say, well, why don't we consider using general fund monies available as our savings account to make the rate increases more uniform, particularly over the course of the next 8 fiscal years. And so then we came to June 1, and we had this additional discussion on scenario 1 versus scenario 3A, and 3A didn't make it in. I guess 3A didn't make it into the final cut, but that's okay. Well, I mean, these are relatively slight differences when you get down to it. My view is that we ought to give some consideration to scenario 3, because I think it smooths out the increases over time. It's a less drastic hit to residents, and because it's hitting them in the pocketbooks with a 24% increase in 6 months, in a 6-month time period. So I thought it was worthy to at least have the discussion on, well, would it be appropriate to use general funds in this respect? Understanding that bond counsel and our FA, our financial analyst, have said we're not concerned as long as it's subordinate, but remembering too that we're going to be borrowing a lot of money in 2028, in that 2029 time period for the wastewater enterprise. So my thought was that we consider scenario 3, to which, if we need to, we get to fiscal year 2028, and we can take that 6%, because we're 5 years away, and we can increase that to 7% if we need to, in order to make equal those cumulative increases. That's why I took issue with the statement, just the assertion that the out years were more problematic. Well, not necessarily. Depending on what you do. The good part about scenario 1 is it's a lot less, obviously. I mean, nobody saw, this is a perfect storm. We didn't see this in 2020 or 2021. Now we're hit with it. Here we go. And scenario 1 is great because from a standpoint of once you get into fiscal year 27, the increases are a lot less. But scenario 3, to me, merited some consideration by the full council, just because it smooths it out over time, and we utilize the general fund in that sense like a savings account. So now, I got to invite comments from everybody.
Yeah, and
Said my piece.
the only thing that I will add that I think will just clarify my point is, for me, it was really helpful to look at the dollar amounts, not just the percentages. So for scenario 1, when we're looking relative to existing rates of 5203, and that's jumping to 5827, and then comparing the 3, it's about $6 for the first, about a little over 4, and then 4 something for the third. So when when Tony and I are disagreeing, we're disagreeing over like $1 something or like $2, is really what it boils down to. And so for me, I just, I think it's just important to make that $1 or $2 investment. And that's something that I'd be willing to make. And so that's why, I am gearing more towards that first one. But I think just looking at the dollars helped me.
Comments?
Yeah. We're willing to hear it.
Who wants to go first? Mr. Tennyson?
I am frankly comfortable with scenario 2 or 3. I would lean towards 2 because it has the least immediate impact on the ratepayers out there. And I agree, we're talking a couple dollars here and there, but for those of our citizens on fixed incomes that aren't getting pay raises or that are living off of Social Security or something like that, a $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 cost increase could be significant. And I'd rather smooth it out, as Vice Mayor Tremblay said, by using general fund money as a loan, as a savings account, to help build the reserves back up.
Want me to add a little bit?
Please.
Well, we have a bunch of poor choices here, but we got to choose one of them. And, my feeling is that's what the general fund is for situations like this. Fortunately, in my tenure in the city, we haven't had to use it substantially over the years, but chickens are coming home to roost to a certain extent right now. We have to choose between one of the 3 scenarios here. To me, yes, the dollar figure isn't that great. I get that, but people have talked to me about the percentage rates, and the percentages do have an impact on certain people and in general here. As I looked at this, 12% is way more than the rate of inflation now, and that does affect my thinking on this here. We've had, I believe, a couple years where we had a 0 rate increase. Is that right? We had a couple years where we didn't raise them at all. And now to say that we're going to raise them 12%, I think was somewhat of a tough sell. However, I do acknowledge that if you go down to the out years, that it goes down somewhat. The rate of increases go down somewhat substantially here. There isn't a whole lot of difference between scenario 2 and 3 other than the impact of the general fund. And my concern about borrowing more from the general fund, and that's specifically why I asked that question, are we going to have enough if we have an unforeseen bill that comes through? And we always do. I mean, that's just unforeseen expenditures are a way of life for everybody here. Scenario 3 does lessen that impact for the general fund here. And again, I'm really concerned about our ability to go out and borrow money and our bond rating. I think that is not only is the amount of money that we've been able to save, but also the amount of money that we can borrow at a better rate is really paramount to the future of our city here, because as we all know, things are going to get nothing but more expensive. I mean, these are all projections here, and we know that things are going to go up. Hopefully not to the rate that we've experienced the last year and a half, but nevertheless, they could. So having all those scenarios and trying to get what the least amount of impact would be to me would be scenario number 3. None of them are great, but we're faced, as Kevin had said, with some unforeseen expenditures here, and, you know, our revenues are all predicated on how much water that we sell, and the drought comes here, and we sell X amount of percentage less gallons of water here, that you're not making as much money. I mean, this is that equilibrium that we're all trying to predict here, but nobody predicted, you know, the severity of the drought back then. I think hopefully have a better model in the future here to try to lessen this, but we have to deal with what we're dealing with. So the suggestion that I had, I would love to be able to pay it all off at one time here, but the impact of a 12% and a 24% in less than 2 years is significant in my view. So my suggestion is that we go on scenario 3 and keep working on this, and maybe, you know, there's been several times when we've done the studies, Kevin, you've been, you know, involved in many of them, that things have changed over the years too, so we can come back and perhaps there be an adjustment up or down, but things do change. But I think at this particular point, scenario 3 would be the one that I think would be the most advantageous for us.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Just two quick comments, and that is, I think it's helpful to review again, and I really think we're all in agreement, there was a perfect storm here. And there were a couple of years where there was a recommendation for no increase in rates, but that was understandable given the circumstances at that time. Since then, in this perfect storm, the city has had to purchase a lot more expensive imported water because our deep wells were down. That's a fact. And secondly, from a drought standpoint, in years 2 and 3 of the drought, we had a decrease in our revenues of about $2 million, if I remember correctly. Our operating revenues decreased about $2 million, which is why, you know, we're obviously we wanted to know on a go-forward basis, using a crystal ball, how much water are we going to sell. I will say, from a transparency standpoint, people need to understand, though, the Utilities Committee is also looking at, because staff has brought it to us, a separate set of rates, potentially, for drought rates. So in other words, if we find ourselves back in a new drought cycle in the future, and these are all subject to Prop 218 as well as these rate increases, there is a possibility that as a separate and segregable fee, we could potentially charge drought rates as well, because the amount of revenue coming in would be drastically decreased. So I don't know if anybody mentioned that here, but I thought I better mention it because that is a potential going forward. But that's not before us tonight. That's a separate issue, but we talked about it at our last Utilities Committee meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comment on that? How about I frame that in the form of a question? Do you have any comments on that one, Mr. Costa?
It's not before you at this moment, but it is in the back of this presentation. So we will be discussing it.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
You're welcome. I guess that.
One more quick question.
One more question,
Yeah.
Mr.
I
Taylor.
know this isn't an action item, but whichever of these scenarios goes forward, when it comes to borrowing from the general fund, will that come back to council each time? Or if we, going forward, say it's scenario 3, that's the max and the money can be moved at any time, or will that require council action each time money is moved from the general fund to the water services?
I don't know if it's required, but I would say we would bring back for council consideration, whether required or not, just to have council involved in those decisions or informed of those decisions. A couple more things I just wanted to add to give a little more perspective to this. You'll see in a couple slides later on that we have historically been on the lower end of the spectrum when comparing to neighboring agencies. And in all 3 of these scenarios, we are still at the lower end, under any of these 3. But also, I think a typical question that comes up is from a customer or ratepayer. We've been conserving water. We've been cutting back on our water usage over the last year, 2 years or more. Why are we having to pay higher rates now? And I know that's a difficult question. I know it's a difficult concept to understand, but there are costs involved in producing the water and making it available, whether or not you turn on your faucet. That is what we're talking about here. Those costs necessary to bring the water to your house are what we're talking about with the increases. And the system that generates that water is the infrastructure and the capital costs that we're talking about maintaining and making sure that they are still available to provide that water to your doorstep.
Thank you for that addition. When we're in a drought and we're using less water, that's less revenue for us. So I guess it's my turn. I don't want to repeat what everybody has said, so I'll be brief. The 12% increases are too much for me, especially within the first 6 months, to have 2 of those 12% increases. So I would opt towards scenario 3, which is what I think Mr. Kildee said and Mr. Tennyson, 2 and 3. I think it's a smoother increase, and I think it gives us a little bit of room with a smaller general fund alone, a little bit more wiggle room. So that's where I would be leaning.
Okay, thank you. I'm hearing a consensus for scenario 3, which we will bring back in August, built into a Proposition 218 notice of those proposed rates under scenario 3 for consideration in October.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that was my second. That was my number 2, so I will definitely support council on that. For the record.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, I'll turn it back over to Kevin to discuss the wastewater side under the Camarillo Sanitary District, CSD.
All right, so we'll leave water, go to CSD. We'll talk about similar long-range drivers. The first, the capital improvement program, so we're looking at replacing the water reclamation plant over the next decade. You'll see on the CIP slide that happens at the end, towards the end of the decade, but we have to build the revenue base to be able to support future borrowing and debt service for those projects. So most of that happening in fiscal years 29 and 30. The assumed borrowing is on the order of $145 million over 10 years, and $30 million is assumed to be funded in grants. Our O&M expenditures on CSD have increased relative to historical. We have some one-time studies that hit cash in the near term, but then also personnel costs, administrative costs reset, and also increased costs at the treatment facilities, operating and maintenance costs. And so what that O&M increase does is it eats away a bit at our debt capacity, and we're looking to borrow quite a lot in the future, and so those rate increases have to be incrementally higher than what we were projecting in prior years. So I won't belabor the rest of this slide. We'll turn to the CIP slide. The list of projects here, a slew in the fiscal year that just closed, and then looking out over the next 10 years from fiscal year 24 out through fiscal year 2032, and then highlighted there are the water reclamation plant upgrades, phase 1 and phase 2. So we have $22 million or so in fiscal year 27, 28, and then the glut there, about $110 million programmed in fiscal year 29 and 30, as well as the reclaimed water storage reservoir project that you see in fiscal year 29 on the order of $12 million. So overall, we're looking at spending $228 million on CSD over the course of 10 years. Recommended financial plan, so these charts and tables will mirror what you just saw in water. So the table showing the implementation month and calendar year, the rate increase that's required, 12% is what we're looking at for the next 7 years. And then we can tick down on the order of 5% thereafter. Proposed debt, we see one borrowing in fiscal year, what is it? That's fiscal year 26. And then the bulk of the borrowing out in fiscal year 29 and 30, and the grants corresponding in fiscal year 29 and 30 as well. So again, what we're required to do here is increase rates so that we can both maintain reserves, both positive and towards or at our reserve policy targets, and then maintain sufficient coverage to be able to borrow for those capital projects. The differences from the 2021 model, which is our, say, not prior year, but prior study model, is almost exclusively due to O&M, as I mentioned. So our project costs remain the same, the borrowings remain the same, the grant assumptions remain the same. What we have is cost pressure on O&M, both in absolute dollars and inflationary pressure. So that's why we need higher increases than what were planned for in the prior study.
Kevin, could you go back to the previous slide just for a second? I just wanted to point something out. Up in that upper right corner, the CSD fund balance with those green bars, there's an example of where you can see that the CSD has very healthy reserves. Looks like maybe 47 million in the bank. A very strong position, but as you can see with the required capital projects, that money is very necessary and gets spent down over the next 5 years, down to 15, and then down to 9, and then has to be built back up.
That brings us to the end of that section. Do we have questions? Mr. Kildee, sorry.
Yeah, I want to focus a little bit on the 12%, and my previous comments about 12% is way greater than the rate of inflation. What's different, I mean, between the water and the sand? I mean, my thinking is that we're talking about a sand, project here that, for the most part, has to be revamped, a lot of capital improvement monies. Is that somewhat the difference between one of the proposal for the water and the sand, the capital improvement projects that we've got to do, and it's financed for the most part, if not totally, by ratepayer rates that they pay?
Yes, for CSD, the primary driver is the CIP, and then it's kind of a waterfall from there. It's the absolute dollars you need to spend, the amount you need to borrow, that requires the debt service, so you need to have the sufficient net revenues to service that debt. And as I mentioned, it looks like we have pressures on CSD on the operating front greater than what we experience on the water side, absent the changes in source of supply and trading off groundwater for purchased water. But leaving that aside, for CSD, we've got increased costs from an aging plant and all that goes into those cost centers in treatment, et cetera.
So does the 12% get us to where we need to go? In other words, because in the out years, I mean, there could be, some adjustments that may have to be made, revenue, perhaps, whatever.
Yes.
We haven't even gone out to bid yet, so these are all estimates here. But the 12%, you're comfortable with 12%, or at least in the beginning, what's going to get us to where we need to go?
Yes, with all the information that we have currently available, all the timing and the magnitude of those projects, and mindful that when we look out 10 years, things start to get a bit fuzzy and project timing changes and design and bid and all that. But when we look at the outputs, we're comfortable that we can maintain sufficient coverage to be able to execute that plant replacement with the rate increases that you see here.
And just a reminder that in each of these models, we look out over a 10-year horizon, but we are only looking for, in October, for discussion and action on the first 2 years. And then we constantly update the information as new information becomes available, and those out years 3 through 10 could be different, will likely be different. And we will revisit those at the next round of rate analysis.
That's all I have.
Okay. Question?
Thanks, Madam Mayor. So, this is these are really difficult numbers. And I mean, this is one reason why when the options come back to us for rehabilitating or either A, rehabilitating the existing water reclamation facility, or B, building a brand-new water reclamation facility. That's why we had, that's why it had such spirited discussion on those options, because there are some cost differentials, as opposed to just building a and I'm not putting you on the spot, Kevin, but our consultant who gave us those options, that's what they're looking at. And I think there will be some significant cost differences in terms of how we approach rehabilitating the water reclamation facility and or basically building a new water reclamation facility. But that will have an impact. But that said, if you could just sort of toggle back and forth between slides 20 and 21, take a look at the CIP. So for example, in fiscal year 2026, there's $20 million there for the Pleasant Valley Road sewer force main, which we're hoping that we are able to obtain some grant funding for that. But if you switch to the next page, look at into the recommended financial plan, we're looking at borrowing $30 million in July of 2025. And if you relate that back to the prior slide and that column relative to potential expenditures in 2026, the first thing to notice is there may be some changes. What we're hoping is that we wouldn't have to borrow that $30 million at that point, because we have to do the flood wall improvements, right? That's the other part of that equation, as well as this. But there may be some possibility here that we may receive some assistance. So these are really difficult numbers, but I guess what I wanted to point out is they are subject to change. The best you can do is sort of crystal ball them for the first year or two, and then in the out years, they are definitely subject to change. Either way you cut it, it's a tough prospect. But I think it's fair to say, I don't know that Councilmember Martinez-Bravo and I had any difference of opinion on this. We just looked at them, and these are very difficult numbers, and we're going to share them with our colleagues.
I think we were just going
And
to
the
share the
public.
difficulties. Yeah.
So that they know what we're faced with, but we're hopeful that they may get a little better over time. On the other hand, I know what inflationary assumptions involved. So, the $55 million in 2030, or in 2029 and 2030, maybe more, just depending. So, okay, thank you.
Any other comments at this point? Okay, continue.
Thank you. So we're going to look at rate comparisons now. We'll go to water, then you'll see sewer service for CSD only, and then we'll show you a combined service bill. So all of these are going to show a typical single-family residential customer in Camarillo, which is a 5/8-inch water meter, 12 units per month of water use. So what we're showing on the chart here is the current Camarillo rates. So you have the lowest or the cheapest, most affordable water service of these agencies that we surveyed. Going back to the water presentation, in scenario 2 or scenario 3, you jump the city of Fillmore, but still have the second lowest, and this is 2 years out. So what we're doing here is looking out to fiscal year 24-25 with those increases that you saw in each scenario, as well as looking at neighboring agencies and either the adopted rates that they have in those years or assuming they have a 4% increase. So trying to be conservative, but not overly conservative on what their increases might look like. So in scenarios 2 and 3, again, just jumping one position. With scenario 1, that would jump one more position, the Camarillo Water District, but still kind of bottom third or at least bottom half as far as affordability. For CSD, same customer and same showing your current position at a service charge of $59.23 with proposed increases, those 12% for the 2 fiscal years, you're up to $74.30. Same approach here where we looked at either adopted or assumed 4% increases for neighboring agencies. And I'll just point out here that agencies are always on different tracks as far as when they're completing the rate studies, if they're adopting 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 5 years of rates. We work with several of these agencies. City of Thousand Oaks is going through a rate study right now. The City of Ventura is right in the middle of a 5-year schedule with planned increases for years 6 to 10. So these are always changing. And the City of Oxnard as well is right in the middle of a wastewater study. So if we look at combined service, so now we take that same single-family customer, this is water and CSD service, which is the bulk of your customer base, and you see the current bill, $111.26, so second lowest to Camarillo. In all water scenarios, plus the CSD 12% increases, we jump the City of Thousand Oaks one position, but still third lowest. So with any of those water scenarios, at least looking 2 years out, we just about maintain our position. Again, mindful that City of Thousand Oaks is going through their own rate proceedings this summer. And we'll pause there for any questions on the rate comparisons.
Kevin.
Got a question?
Go ahead.
I think it's important to note that we've always tried to be somewhere in the middle in our rates compared to our brethren to the, east and west of us. So within that realm, and I know that it's somewhat debatable, but in that realm, does this scenario keep us in that conversation?
It's hard to say. It's a bit hard to say because, each agency has their own cost drivers. It depends on lots of things. So water service is going to depend on where they procure their water. Is it relatively inexpensive local groundwater, or is it somebody like the City of Thousand Oaks and Simi Valley that are entirely reliant on imported water? On the wastewater side, age of infrastructure, the desire or the willingness to reinvest in the system, that comes into play as far as rates being high or low. All sorts of other things come into play. So I always say that these comparisons are a bit of lemons and limes. They're not exactly apples to apples. So it just becomes a bit difficult to say.
What would the ramifications be if we don't invest in our system at this particular point?
Our treatment of our wastewater will be out of compliance with regulatory permit requirements. Right now, our plant, the majority of it is past its useful life, and the majority of the components need to be replaced to continue functioning at the appropriate, with the appropriate processes to meet our permit requirements for treating wastewater.
But we are in compliance at this point, but in the future, there's potential that we would not be.
If we don't, we could continue down the road that we have on making repairs and essentially limping along, and which ultimately you wind up in a world of hurt with even worse condition of infrastructure that is going to be more costly to repair. So it's taking the steps is why we did the master plan to identify what is needed and what the estimated cost is. And the prudent thing to do is to move forward with improving and replacing those components that are necessary as soon as possible.
Something like a Band-Aid approach, at some point, you're going to have to remove the Band-Aid and clean the wound out? Is that kind of, I know it's not a very good scenario, but it's something of that case. It's kind of the pay me now or pay me later kind of thing.
Right.
Mm. It's just a little more money than that, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, that's all I have.
So we will turn to our last item of the night, which are drought rates or drought surcharges. Background on the subject, as was mentioned by Vice Mayor Tremblay, drought rates are supplemental rates or surcharges to our normal condition rates. These are temporary in nature. They're really for bridging the financial gap during shortfalls in revenues because of either declared shortage, mandatory conservation, or other water emergencies. They are considered rates in California and are subject to Prop 218, just like our normal water rates and CSD rates. These rates, they are discretionary, and so they can be implemented and rescinded at the discretion of council as conditions change. And ultimately, what this is, it's an additional tool in the toolbox to, again, recover the net revenue loss or bridge that financial gap when we have reduced water sales and we have reduced water revenues. So the steps that we follow, and the Utilities Committee saw this in a greater degree of detail over a couple different meetings. So the first one is to estimate what our demand reductions are at each either level of shortage and how our demand changes throughout the system and user classes. The second step is to estimate what our net costs are. So as we sell less water, we generate less revenue, but we also have some avoided costs that we want to account for. We may also have changes in our water supply mix that either increase or decrease those total costs of supply. And then we might also have one-time operating costs. So think of additional conservation efforts, outreach, et cetera. So we want to estimate those costs. The third step is to identify an appropriate rate structure. So just like our water rates can have different levels of fixed and variable revenues. They can have tiers and different types of user classes. So can our drought rate structure change. And then the last step is to just perform an impact analysis. How do the results in the selected structure impact our customers? So these are the three structures that we evaluated for the Utilities Committee. The selected or the recommended is what's highlighted or boxed in there. We refer to it as a uniform percentage increase. So what that means is we have a schedule of rates, water rates that vary by customer class and within residential users by tier. And so when we estimate that net revenue loss, we think of it in percentage terms, and we apply that relative to our base rates. And so the surcharges are going to vary based on your customer class and your tier, just like the base condition rates. Just for full transparency, the other two options that were evaluated is the one on the left, which we refer to as a uniform commodity rate. So that's the kind of, we're all in the boat together in shortage, and we come up with, say, $1 per unit of water, and it doesn't matter what customer class or what tier of water use you use, you pay that $1, where in this uniform percentage it varies. And then on the right, we also modeled a fixed charge approach, so this would vary by meter size. So that guarantees revenue recovery, but it doesn't give any control to a customer over their bill. So they might reduce their use, might reduce it significantly in shortage, but they would be hit with a surcharge that's entirely fixed. So again, the recommended is this uniform percentage approach. If you were to move forward, that's what's recommended. And showing in the table here are our various customer classes. So we have a 3-tier rate structure for single family and for multifamily. And then we have our primary non-residential customers, CIG standing for commercial, industrial, governmental. And then we have our landscape and agricultural and construction uses, and then airport water. Baseline rates, that just so happens to correspond with scenario 3 from the water rates presentation, so that we had to make some assumption for the surcharges tonight. So what's shown there is assumed 9% increase. And then the surcharges themselves, again, relating the net revenues that we lose at a certain level of shortage, so level 1 being up to a 15% reduction, we translate that into dollars and cents, or in this case, just cents. So for example, single family tier 1, a baseline rate of $2.43, based on the revenue that we lose in a level 1, that would require an 18-cent surcharge on top of that $2.43. Now, since they vary by class and tier, in tier 2, you see that surcharge is 26 cents, and in tier 3, 36 cents. So the higher water use would be hit with a slightly higher surcharge. So the lowest surcharge on the most essential and lowest tier use. And those increases, we have increased severity, so level 1 being up to 15%, then 25% in level 2, 35%, and up to 45% in level 4. And again, these would be triggered by all sorts of different conditions, whether state-mandated conservation, water purveyor restrictions, or local water emergencies like you're losing groundwater wells and having to transition to much more costly imported water. Just to wrap on the drought rate presentation, again, these are subject to Proposition 218, and so if the council did want to entertain it in this rate cycle, they would have to be part of the notice with the standard city water rates and the CSD rates. Those rates or surcharges, they represent the maximum, so just like our baseline rates, when we adopt a schedule of rates, we're really adopting a maximum. Council can always adopt or implement something less than those maximums. And you also have the discretion to use reserves in lieu of drought rates, should you require them, defer capital projects if it's prudent, utilize something else under your conservation authority, things like drought penalties outside of the realm of rates, or some combination of all these things. So again, these drought rates or drought surcharges are just one more tool in the toolbox. And we'll take your questions.
Do we have questions? Mr. Kildee?
Yeah, Kevin, who makes the determination as to whether or not you're going to go back into a drought or not? Who invariably has that final say on that?
Might be appropriate for staff.
It would definitely be city council action would be necessary to add a surcharge for a drought rate, a drought condition. As Kevin mentioned, the triggers for that happening could vary. It would have been nice to have these drought rates in place as a tool to go to last year when we were faced with a mandatory reduction in water conservation, going to 1 day a week watering, right? So we would know at that point, if that happened again, we would know that our revenue levels are going to suffer. Revenues are going to go down because of reduced water use. So at that time, what we would do is staff would put together a recommendation to come to council with, based on the estimated level of revenue reduction, what level of drought rate surcharge would need to be put in place to maintain our revenues at the necessary level to cover the costs of providing the water.
So I just want to make sure that I have this right. So obviously the council would be the one that would be able to implement this. We would have this at our disposal, but we'd also be following state guidelines by what is or isn't the drought situation that we find ourselves. That would be one of the trigger points in that. In other words, a mandatory reduction that would come from someplace other than the city.
Right, that's what we would most likely occur, is what we have experienced in the past also. So that would be the most likely scenario. What this does is it just gives, like I mentioned, another helpful tool in the toolbox to be able to deal with situations where our water revenues would be reduced significantly. So whatever that cause and trigger is, that's what information we would bring forward with a recommendation to recover lost revenue, reduced revenue.
And if we do have it in place and we have to flip the switch, we would have to go out in a 218 process.
No,
It
no,
would
that's
not have,
actually.
it would not have to be a 218.
It would not have to be a 218 process. That's what this initial, if council so decides to include these proposed drought rates in the current coming forward 218 process, that would establish those.
That would assess, so that would be the 218 process that would be implemented.
Correct.
So we wouldn't have to revisit that again if in fact we
Exactly.
do go back into a drought.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks for
I'd say in an ideal situation, we may never need these, but by building them into this Prop 218 process, we have them available should we ever need them.
That's all I have.
Mr. Tremblay?
Can you go back to the slide entitled Recommended Drought Rate Surcharges? Yeah, I think what I'm hearing Councilmember Kildee's question is, I could be wrong, Kevin, and that is that are the level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, so are you equating that to the level 1, level 2, level 3 stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 announcements from DWR and Metropolitan and Callegas, or this is something different?
No, it's something different.
Okay, that's what
Right.
I just want to get that on the table. I think what the Utilities Committee needs to know, if I'm being presumptuous about this, is what do our colleagues, should we move forward with putting through a Prop 218 process, putting in a drought rate structure, and if the answer to that is yes, is this structure, and particularly the uniform percentage methodology, acceptable to the rest of the council members? So that's kind of what is that okay?
Yes.
That's what we need to know.
Yes, and Councilmember Tremblay and I did agree on the middle one, the uniform percentage.
So if we had this in place before, would have helped the situation that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, who has comments?
I'll just say I would support the recommended drought rate surcharges for the Prop 218 process.
Mr. Kildee, do you have a,
No, I don't have any further questions, and
Okay.
I'd support it as well.
okay. And I support it as well, so.
Oops.
Does that give the direction that's needed?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So just to wrap up, looking at the schedule, tonight we had the discussion on the rate scenarios. We had the 2019 water bond retirement resolution. Next item would be, related to this, would be the August 23rd City Council meeting to authorize the Prop 218 notification process, which starts the 45-day period, culminating in the October 11th City Council and CSD meeting, which is the public hearing to consider the rates. And then on the sewer rates, CSD rates, require a second reading because it is an ordinance. And if rates are adopted on those nights, the rates would become effective January 1st.
I have a procedural question, maybe, Counselor. Do we need a motion? It's a joint discussion and feedback. Do we need a motion on this?
I think staff has gotten the direction based on all your comments, and he just sort of recaptured what that was. So no.
Should ask with the CAM-SAN, are we on the same level as far as that goes as well? Okay. And I'll ask the staff, you have good direction from us here tonight?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I just want to thank our Utilities Committee for their countless hours and for our staff. I know this has been a lot of work, so we really appreciate all the work and time you put into it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, so with that, I'll adjourn the Camarillo Sanitary District meeting for July 12th.
And that brings us down to the end of our agenda. And I know that we wanted to adjourn in the honor of Walter McKinney. Did you want to say a few words?
Yeah, if I could say...
Mayor, if I could just put on the record, I'm very sorry. Just for the record, there was no reportable action taken in closed session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Walt McKinney, born in Oxnard, spent his whole life in Camarillo and Oxnard, and he loved the city. And he was a real tall guy, and he could be a somewhat intimidating person, but he had a heart of gold, and he was just a lovable person. And I remember when I was first elected to the council, he called me and told me about how happy he was that I was elected. I've known his family practically my whole adult life. I know his daughter, Michelle, very, very well. And I think the smile that he has on his face, that's kind of how he lived his life. So I think it's very appropriate that we recognize the great life that Walt McKinney had. He lived to be 93. So that's a full life. And he was relatively healthy his whole life, too. So life well lived. And I'm honored that my council members have agreed to adjourn and the great memory and the great life that Walt McKinney had.
Thank you for that. Without anything else, we will go ahead and adjourn in the memory of Walter Thomas McKinney. That was a long.